Hi. Hi, welcome to Dead Air Live. I'm Jean Flanagan of Somerville Producers Group. And tonight we're going to talk about the air we breathe. We're going to talk about environmental protection action and justice and what we can do locally, a little bit about what's not being done federally. And my guest tonight is Emanuela Kostener. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Good. And what brings you into, what are you doing in the environmental arena right now?
I'm currently a student at Northeastern University, and I was a president of the Northeastern Students for Environmental Action, which is the student activism group on campus dedicated to environmental issues. And in addition to that, I've been involved with other student groups and communities in the area as well, in another broader coalition pushing for greater environmental sustainability and greening of the community that we live in.
Okay, so sustainability is a big issue. What does environmental sustainability mean?
It's a hard topic. I think the United Nations have been trying to address this, and in about the mid-'80s they came to about a loose definition of what it is, and it meant living in such a way such that we preserve our resources for the generations to come. And that is being broken down into a whole different myriad of other categories, and one can argue more or less the intensity of those.
Okay, okay. So then you start to get into the individual topics within that. What are some of the topics that fit inside of that?
Inside of sustainability, we could have topics as varied as transportation, public planning, farming, sustainable farming practices, agriculture, sustainable design, under which green living falls. Okay. Let's see, sustainable procurement or environmentally preferable procurement, where you buy goods which are grown in a sustainable way or which are made out of recyclable materials. You have energy in there, which falls, which is broken down into a wide array of other smaller categories, such as energy efficiency, such as renewable energy, be it geothermal, solar, winds, and the like, microturbines. There's a great array of new technologies which are emerging in the renewable energy sector. And in addition to that, I suppose you could include quality of life as well, public health, and how that is being impacted by the degradation of the environment. A lot of this is related to the air that we breathe, is related to the air, is related to the water, where we swim, which we drink. It's related to the soils under which we are around. If we have brownfields in our community, those affect our kids if they play within them.
What in our community?
Brownfields, which
what are brownfields?
They're contaminated soils with hazardous chemicals, and they have to undergo a certain process to remove those chemicals in order for them to be healthy and suitable for development, for example, for gardening or for building of a school or a playground there.
Okay, so issues around that. So let's just start with the big picture. And the UN's working on defining some of these things, and the federal government is doing.
It depends from which country we're talking about. Some nations have allied together to address issues of climate change, which is spurred by environmental degradation. Some nations have decided that, such as our own and such as other developing and developed nations, have decided that they can't really quite figure out the economic cost of pushing for certain environmental standards, so they have decided to put on the back burner some of these issues. So instead of raising for higher quality of air or higher quality of water, we have decided to allow more chemicals in, just to make it for the sake of the industry, just so that we don't stir anything up that we might not be able to fully understand right now. Okay. There just hasn't been a lot of time or research devoted really to see that we can actually merge business and environmental sustainability together and have them progress commingled at the same time.
Right. Okay. So at the federal level, we're sort of in a log jam that hasn't gone anywhere. And I don't think that's news to very many people.
At the federal level, we're rolling back on previous laws. We're allowing more arsenic into the water. We're allowing more mercury into the water. We both know that those contribute to birth defects and to neurological diseases. It affects your motor and your sensors and the like. So it's not good for public health. If you have a nation of people who are mostly ailing in hospitals and who are asking for money to help pay for these rising medical bills, you don't have people who are working, you don't have people who are boosting the economy, you don't really have a healthy population, and that's not really helping your economy in the end. Right now, there is no CO2 cap or any kind of CO2 emission regulations on a federal level. CO2 is just not being recognized as a pollutant, as you'll see in commercials which will air pretty soon in response to or in anticipation of Al Gore's upcoming movie. You will see that a lot of companies are trying to debate that CO2 is actually a very essential chemical and that we not be able to survive without it. That is very true, but we also have to understand that taking carbon that has been stored for millions of years in the earth, such as the ones in petroleum or such as the one which has been solidified into coal, and releasing that into the atmosphere is an irreversible process and is one which is affecting our health as we have it. A lot of that CO2 is into diesel emissions. Is into diesel fuels, and that is one of the most noxious diesel emissions are some of the most noxious ones which you experience at a community level. They might not be linked as much to a global warming, but when it comes to the direct people who are breathing that kind of air, there is a remarkable impact into the health of those people.
Okay.
And usually children and the elderly who are being affected.
Oh, good. Okay, we have a videotape of talking about those diesel emissions. If you could tell us who's speaking and what group is speaking on this for this tape, because we didn't put the intro part in. So it's David Cash. David Cash will be speaking. He's actually going to be speaking in this part. And the other gentleman is
Tony Chavez.
They're
both outstanding fellows. They're directors. They're key actors in the Massachusetts Executive Office of Environmental Affairs, which is pushing for highest standards of environmental sustainability in the Commonwealth. Mr. Tony Chavez is a director of environmental justice for the Commonwealth, and David Cash is a director of air. So he's espousing higher standards for the air that we breathe.
Okay, we'll come back to the Department of Environmental Justice after.
Environmental protection, yeah.
Well, the whole justice, the word justice in there is sort of a new concept to me, so we'll come back to that. But let's go to the tape, and we're going to listen to David Cash talk about the air and diesel emissions.
Air, Waste and Energy for the Executive Office of Environmental Affairs.
Thank you very much, Tony. Thanks, Vital, and thanks everyone for making space for me here today. Let me pass out one of these. You'll notice that this is actually shorter than what I show you up here. I wanted to save some paper because I'm going to fly through about 20 slides on health data that is kind of background, which, as Tony mentioned, I don't think you're going to need to be convinced of, but it's part of the main show. As Tony mentioned, one of the big concerns has been, particularly in environmental justice communities, are elevated rates of air pollution-related health impacts. And one of the prime contributors to that are diesel engines from a variety of different kinds of fleets. And we've been working closely with DEP over the last year or so in thinking about how we might develop a strategy to address diesel. One of the difficult things about it is that there are many different fleets. There are a lot of different kinds of mechanisms that one could use to address the sources of pollution from these different fleets. There are federal regulations that preempt state action. There's some efforts that EPA has been making on the voluntary front, and I think perhaps most important is that over the last year and a half, DEP has been working on developing an inventory to identify where the major sources of diesel emissions are from, because without that inventory, we can't really target well. And so as that inventory became completed, and as we looked over the last couple of months, looked at this next year at EOEA, Secretary Pritchard has definitely taken addressing diesel as one of his priorities. And part of the process of developing that strategy is having informal meetings like this at this very early stage of pulling together ideas, getting input from a variety of different stakeholders. And so what I'd like to do is run through this slideshow and then have some time to get feedback. You're welcome to stop me at any point if you have questions, but why don't I go through this here. So here's a summary of the talk today. Diesel emissions have significant health impacts and associated economic costs. Not a surprise to anybody, but the data is becoming higher and higher quality, stemming from research that's been done over the last decade plus that has identified particulate matter as one of the main causes of a variety of different respiratory and cardiac impacts. Our first estimates of what some of the health-related costs are due to diesel emissions in the Commonwealth are in the range of $3.2 billion a year. And I'll break that down in a little bit, you'll see, but that's a pretty big number. And that should be on everybody's radar as a source of concern. And there are a number of kinds of different cost-effective actions that can be taken in the near term and in the long term. And part of what I'm going to talk about in terms of this strategy is identifying what are some of the near-term, high-impact efforts that we can make in the next year, but then charting a course for what might take longer time to address. So if we're looking at legislative or regulatory action, those are things that are most likely going to take longer than putting in place, if we can get the funding, some kind of retrofit program. There's a window of opportunity right now. There's a lot of actions already going on at the federal level, at the state level, municipalities, NGOs, a number of different communities around here, Medford, Boston, Somerville, Cambridge, other parts of the state as well have taken actions in terms of retrofitting their own fleets, at least in part. So there's already an understanding that this is a problem that needs to be addressed. And as I mentioned, there's a better understanding of what the scientific understanding of what the risks are. So essentially, as we're thinking about this roadmap, and this is very tentative, this is why I'm sitting down with you right now, is if this roadmap doesn't make sense, should be changed, et cetera, this is the time to get input either in this meeting or later contacting me. But essentially, we want to base this strategy on the diesel inventory. So use the inventory to say, hey, these are the worst polluting sectors, set both near and long-term goals to accelerate already or soon to be federal actions, or EPA has just put in new engine standards and new fuel standards, but those are not going to affect particularly engines for a long time because turnover of diesel fleets is relatively slow. So we're thinking about this as two steps. One, coming up with some kind of kickoff, so put some program into place that can act as a catalyst for the more comprehensive policy, something that's very cost effective, target the low-hanging fruit, most sensitive populations, and then use that to develop a more comprehensive strategy. Why is diesel a problem? So this is the health part, and I'm going to try to go through here very quickly, but we're amassing now quite a bit of data to identify what the major problems are here. And again, not surprisingly, respiratory problems like asthma, heart disease, cancer, these are all problems that have been associated with diesel. And one of the ways that we've thought about this is trying to identify, using this kind of causal chain of figuring out what the emissions are. Well, we don't really care about the emissions. What we care about is, well, how much of the stuff stays in the air. Even that we don't care that much about. It's how much you're breathing in. Even that, what we're really concerned about is what are the risks and the health impacts, right? So diesel is being emitted in Somerville but blowing out into Boston Harbor, we don't, and it's not having a health impact, we have less a concern about that. But as I'll show in the story, that is not what is happening. So I'm going to fly through these maps here, and essentially the take-home message is illustrated in this map. All of these maps will show greater concentration, greater emissions, greater concentration, greater risks in the eastern part of the state, in urban areas, et cetera. So this is emissions of all PM from all sources, not just diesel. So power plants, industry, et cetera. And again, darker means greater emissions in those areas. Here's a similar map, but just for diesel sources. So these emissions, again, not surprisingly, are higher in the eastern part of the state where we have greater transportation, greater construction going on, et cetera. Not to mention also the transport of emissions coming from other parts of the state and further west, in fact. But now if we look at concentration, so this is just saying how much PM is emitted, is coming out of tailpipes, is coming out of stacks. Well, how much is hanging around in the air? What's the ambient concentration? And again, in eastern Massachusetts, we are almost in non-attainment, and as new rules go into place this summer, we might be in non-attainment. This is under the Clean Air Act. So we're at, remember the number, roughly 10 to 15 micrograms. That's roughly the ambient concentration in this part of the state, 10 to 15 micrograms per cubic meter of particulate. So that's if you just went outside and had monitoring stations that weren't sensitive to local truck traffic, local bus traffic. This is kind of as if you mixed it all into a soup and it was evenly distributed. For some pollutants, that's the right thing to measure. For particulates, you're concerned about hot spots, and I'll talk about that in this next slide. So here's a study that was done at the Harvard School of Public Health by John Levy and others, and basically this took monitors of PM and had people walking around the Dudley Square area of Boston. And essentially the darker brown colors are where there are higher concentrations. And we would most likely see a similar kind of map in areas of Somerville, in areas of Everett, et cetera, where we see a lot of bus traffic, truck traffic, diesel locomotives going through. And the darkest brown, the concentrations are 120 to 350 micrograms per cubic meter. So remember the number I told you to remember was 10 to 15. So we're seeing hot spots here that are an order of magnitude or more greater. And that's not, given what all the research is showing now, that's not a big surprise. PM is a problem when you encounter it in hotspots in areas like this. But we want to, so this is just saying about concentration. Further studies, again, this is through John Levy's group at the Harvard School of Public Health, is saying, well, okay, you're saying the concentrations are high, but what are the exposures? In other words, how much are people breathing in? And here's a map of Boston where they've done statistical analyses that combine both the concentration of the pollutant, concentration of people, traffic patterns, et cetera. Again, not a surprising story. Where you see more people and more traffic, you'll see higher exposure. Okay? Again, this also changes. So you can see here how you have variation within the city itself. Downtown has greater exposure, but you also see this in time of day. Again, not surprising. What you see, that spike on the left-hand side, is during rush hour. So those are hours of the day on the x-axis, and concentration of one particular part of PM 2.5. And again, not surprisingly, in downtown Boston, that's the green line, green and red lines, during rush hour in the beginning part of the day, you see spikes of PM concentration. And you can do these kinds of studies, again, in the Dudley Square area, in the Porter Square T-stop. If you're downstairs, you see tremendous spikes as the trains come through. So again, PM, one of the problems of PM are these hot spots that you see, and they're by geography, by time of day. So again, well, we don't really care about exposure if PM isn't a problem, but we know that PM is a problem. So this is a map that shows elevated risk, increased likelihood of cancer, lifetime cancer per million from diesel pollution. You can't see those numbers at the bottom, but the eastern part of the state is in the range of 300 to 500 more lifetime cases per million. Now, to put that in perspective, EPA starts getting really nervous when a pollutant increases lifetime risk by more than 1 in a million. So this is a big concern. Now, this doesn't mean that there are 500 more cases per year of cancer. This means your lifetime risk is increased by that amount. And this just breaks it down by county within Massachusetts. It's essentially the same as that map, but essentially saying these are the excess lifetime cancer risks per million in these particular counties. So Suffolk County, which is the third highest in the country, has about 2,000 more lifetime cancer risks per million associated with PM 2.5. Tony had mentioned asthma. Again, here's a story that I'm sure you're all familiar with, but New England has higher asthma rates compared with other parts of the country. And here's the work done by ARC and others showing New England has higher rates than the rest of the U.S. Massachusetts has higher rates than other parts of New England. Diesel, we know, is only one contributor to that. We're not claiming that diesel causes all asthma. There's a lot of indoor air pollution that has been cited as risks as well, but it's certainly one part of the story. And then here's the slide that I think is the most concerning, and this is premature deaths. So if we're kind of talking about what are the health concerns, I think death would rate pretty highly up there as one of our concerns. And basically, so this is a study that was done by Joel Schwartz at the Harvard School of Public Health, who had been at EPA for many years. This graph controls for all other kinds of things that might cause increases in premature death that also might be associated with higher concentrations. Weather has been controlled for, age of population, smoking, all those kinds of things. And essentially what this says is that as you increase the concentration from 10 to 20 micrograms per cubic meter, you're increasing the percent increase in death by 2%. So that's just taking those, changing the, going from here to here in a particular area, just in ambient concentration, not in hotspots, increases from roughly here to here, 2%. Okay? Now, to put that into perspective, what that means is in the U.S., there are 2.5 million deaths per year. Roughly 24,000 of those deaths are associated with AIDS. So that's 1% of the deaths are AIDS-related. So that would mean that's equivalent to if we moved from, say, 15 micrograms to 20. So a change of 5 micrograms is associated with a 1% increase in deaths. So that's equivalent to AIDS deaths. If we looked at something like breast cancer, that's roughly equivalent to if we were to reduce the concentration by 10 micrograms, is roughly equivalent to solving breast cancer, 40,000 deaths per year, okay? And this study is only looking at the acute effects. So this is saying on a day where you're getting greater PM concentration, you're going to get X more heart attacks, et cetera, because of that higher concentration. This doesn't take into account the cancer, the higher risk because of cancer, because that's a chronic effect, not an acute effect, okay? So here are the numbers that I mentioned before if we're looking at costs. So if we take all that health impact data and then overlay it with the economic costs, so what does it cost to go to the hospital? What are the work days that are lost? And what's really driving this number, the $3.2 billion that I mentioned, is the premature deaths. Now.
Okay, welcome back. And David had a lot of information to talk about that had a lot of technical details. So we're going to try to just get to what was his, I got his point. I think everybody understood the particulate matter in the air is causing increased health risks, including increased deaths. How was he relating that to AIDS and breast cancer? I think that got I think first time round that was a little hard to catch. Yeah.
So the first part was a bit more turgid and a bit more intense, but I feel that as the conversation progressed, he kind of nailed the issue and tried to pull together all the different causes and show the one accumulated effect of all these different factors. And what he was talking about was that the particulate matters, which are particulates, which are small particles which we find in diesel emissions, are impacting are impacting the health of the Commonwealth. These kind of particulate matters are not small enough to be inhaled by the parts of our lungs, that they get stuck in them, and they cause complications, and that's why you see shortness of breath, and that's why you see asthma, and in the long term, that's why you see a higher likelihood of heart attacks and ultimately premature death. So I think the way that he was relating the ppm, the particulate matters in the air, which were released by diesel, to the health effects was that not even looking at asthma, not even looking at smaller, more inconsequential ailments such as shortness of breath or such as inability to do more vigorous activity or the like, just looking specifically at death rates, increasing the amount of particulate matters from 10 particulate matters per cubic feet to 20 particulate matters per cubic feet is equivalent to 40,000 deaths. Now, putting that into perspective, he's saying that some of the roughest sicknesses in the U.S., AIDS, and for example, breast cancer, which he used for example,
Right.
yeah,
Which are heavily funded. A lot of money goes into preventing those as deaths. I mean, so that's the comparison. Is there's a lot of money, federal money being dedicated to those purposes.
Right. He was saying that the equivalent of reducing the particulate matters from one specific number to another specific number is just about the equivalent of eliminating those kind of deaths from AIDS or from cancer. And he's saying there is no way right now, we don't have the means to cure AIDS or to cure breast cancer, but we do have a tangible, concrete way of addressing particulate matters and addressing and reducing them in such a way that they don't cause these extra deaths. He was outlining the economic impact of having all these extra ailments and sicknesses. He said that it amounts to a great amount of money that the Commonwealth is losing. It's a
So what's
It amounts
so he was
to-
talking about retrofitting a bus
Yes.
fleet. What's the retrofit?
What he's talking about is it's placing a kind of contraption by the tailgate of the bus. Since most buses run on diesel, they emit diesel emissions, and there's two different kinds of retrofits that you can use for a
essentially
bus.
just straightforward filtering out the particulate matter.
One of them is more filter, another one I think is a more kind of advanced catalytic converter. We're not quite familiar with the terminology of it as well, but we just are familiar with the fact that they reduce a certain amount of the particulate matters which are emitted by this specific bus. It's proven that as children travel on school buses to get to school, they inhale a certain amount of particulate matters, and that aggravates or increases their likelihood of becoming asthmatic or from developing these kind of ailments. So by putting these retrofits on school buses, which most kids in our city and in the Commonwealth are using, we're making sure that our kids are healthier, and we're making sure that the parents of those kids do not miss work days in order to care for their kids, that they're staying fully gainfully employed and contributing to the economy of the Commonwealth. So that's what we're saying. We're saying that we're improving quality of life by putting in place these simple emission reduction measures.
Right. Okay, and that would have to function at a city level because the city controls the buses that run in the city. So you have to.
Or a state level.
There's right. The MBTA would be state level, and then the
Partial.
city buses. So you have to sort of work at both levels to convince them that the money that it takes to put on these systems onto the buses is worthwhile.
You are right, though. I think that right now we're focusing on municipalities and focusing on the municipalities and their fleet of school buses, since they're the ones which own them and deal with them. And you were saying that there's a very slow turnover rate for diesel buses. So if you have a fleet of buses which run on diesel and are not as efficient and release a lot of particulate matters which get kids sick, it's unlikely that you'll change those fleet of buses anytime soon. They have a pretty high life. So might as well fix them right now and make them function better while you have them.
Okay, so this is a way to make the buses that you already have function better, so that you don't have to.
Exactly.
I mean, investing in new buses is huge.
Exactly.
It's a big.
And he was speaking about trying to improve air quality through other measures, but he was saying how that clashes with a lot of federal statutes. We do not want to overstep our area of jurisdiction, and we do not want to step on the feet of the federal government. So there's only certain areas in which we can effect for greater and for more improved air quality, for better environmental protection. And I think that this is one specific area that the state has pinpointed in which we can have a specific, tangible mean of bettering it.
Okay. Now, which brings up the whole jurisdiction thing, brings up the idea of environmental justice.
I see.
So let's move into that, and tell me what environmental justice
Sure.
is, and how that differs from just environmental protection, or.
All right. Environmental justice is part of environmental protection. I think it's deemed later in maybe around the 60s or the 70s, this concept of environmental justice emerged. We see the environmental movement kind of surface and emerge maybe in the earlier part of the centuries with Teddy Roosevelt's protection of the bears and the creation of the first national parks. And we see in the beginning of the century this great focus on protecting wildlife and on protecting open spaces and protecting these spaces for recreation and for the beauty of them. But in this way of framing the environmental protection movement in this way, it has alienated a lot of people which could have been very instrumental in this movement, and particularly those would be inner city folks. So you would have a lot of minorities, and you would have a lot of poor people in the inner city, which would actually be most affected by environmental inequalities. But to them, the environmental movement didn't quite appeal. There would be no kind of appeal to them, for example, to protect a ski slope or to make for better beaches or to protect the to protect the beauty of the Great Canyon, if there's no way that they would ever have the means to visit those kind of things, right, or to fully enjoy them. So the movement has been pretty distanced by these constituencies, which could have had a great impact, or could have had a great say into how the environmental movement was to go ahead. So the groups which have been disfranchised in the past and which is still disenfranchised right now, which are minorities, which are poor people, and which are also indigenous groups, such as Native Americans.
Yep.
They have come together and they have realized that they're being impacted greatly by environmental inequalities. For example, Native Americans have had their lands taken away from them and have been pushed away to more arid areas, so that now they have areas which are pretty much environmentally damaged and that cannot really quite sustain them. They have had nuclear waste placed on their lands just because there's less resistance. Likewise, there have been more nuclear sites or waste treatment plants, or, for example, oil refineries placed in communities which have poor people or minority people, just because there's least resistance in those kind of communities. You see in Boston how we have major bus depots and major bus centers into areas which have a high percentage of minorities and of poor people. And if you look at Roxbury, you see that they have Dudley and they have the Ruggles stations, and those have dozens of buses running through them every single day at any given time. And in those areas, there's a higher rate of emissions, there's a higher rate of particulate matters, and associated with that, there's a decreased quality of life. People get sick more often, people don't have as much clean air, people have more polluted water because of that, people have a lot of damage and a lot of degraded soil due to the chemicals and due to the pollutants in their neighborhoods. So this is where I think in the 1990 communities have come together and have forged together and have penned down the first declaration of environmental justice. And they have asked for equal protection from environmental hazards and special consideration to communities which have been affected in the past by having more of these environmental nuisances placed in the neighborhoods.
Okay, so it's it's a backlash in a certain way of where environmental protection has been ignored, and then they're all grassroots community.
Mostly.
So it's the bottom up sort of area of
Exactly.
environmental stuff.
And it has been successful in some areas, but particularly in Boston, some areas which are decreed as environmental justice areas would be Roxbury, would be Dorchester. We know that they have a lot of bus lines run through there as well. They also have trains run through there as well. But again, you see that the community does not quite benefit from the sound nuisance or from the chemical nuisance which the trains leave behind, which pass through the neighborhoods, because there's no stop right now for those people. So even though they have to carry the burden of having this kind of extra transportation in their neighborhood, they do not quite benefit from it. Chelsea is another neighborhood which has a lot of chemical treatment plants and has more which are being planned right now. And Somerville obviously is one as well. We have one of the lowest densities of open space in New England, and that is pretty significant in that we have more roads, more cars, more people in areas where there are more emissions, and ultimately more people who are bound to get sick. So because of that, we're asking for extra consideration when it comes to bettering structures which are already in place, which are emitting pollutants, and we're asking for extra consideration in the future erectment of such structures, such as waste treatment plants or extra bus depots, which might potentially degrade the quality of life.
Mm-hmm. So you're part of some student groups at Northeastern.
Yes.
And are there similar student groups at Tufts? Because that would be our sort of local, our local college for college students. Would there be groups at Tufts that would be similar that students could go and find out more about?
Tufts has a student group called ECO. They have been working on environmentally preferable purchasing, which means divesting from, I guess this kind of goes away from my subject, but it means divesting from countries or companies which have blatant human rights violations or which have blatant environmental violations. Okay. They've also worked in energy conservation in one of their Do It in the Dark campaigns, which aim to get residents and dorms to reduce the energy consumption. It also has a pretty big Earth Day. I know, we have tried to replicate it at Northeastern University. Not as much of a success. And if you aim to target the college student population as a means to get change affected, there is a loose umbrella of student groups. It's called BASIC, Boston Area Students Environmental Coalition, where myself along with other student groups work to reduce the emissions in our university such that we can be better neighbors. So for example, Northeastern University, which is right next to Roxbury, which is one community which has the highest asthma rates in New England. I think a third of the children in Roxbury have asthma.
Wow.
We're working to reduce our diesel emissions in our own fleet on campus. So we're trying to reduce the diesel emissions in our fleet events. I think we only have about 20, and in our generators, and we're pushing for biodiesel, which is a cleaner kind of, it's a cleaner blend of diesel. That is still in the works, but it's definitely going ahead.
It's actually vegetable.
It's undergoing
It's vegetable based instead of petroleum based, so it does not have some of the particulate matters.
It's lye and ethanol. It's a very simple process for it. So likewise, I suppose the Tufts could as well push for some measures of reducing its reducing its campus emissions, such that it can be a better neighbor to both Medford and Somerville. If you want to go away from college groups, though.
Yeah. What's in the community? What groups can the community people participate in?
Somerville and other cities have local groups which aim to deal with climate change, try to remedy climate change at a local level, and also try to be more mindful to protect the health of the community via pushing for more sustainability measures in the immediate area. So for example, Newton has their Newton Green Decade group, and Cambridge has their own Green Decade group as well. Somerville has the Somerville Climate Action Group, which has been working closely with the mayor in the past few years in drafting a climate action plan, which has a few key points.
Yeah, let's what are the key? So the Somerville Climate Action Group.
Yes.
Okay, so they're looking at things that impact Somerville's air and climate. And so
I think that
what are some of those things?
Right, so just as David Cash was saying, you have to quantify damage, and you have to quantify where the emissions are coming from in order for you to know where to act on, and in order for you to have a solid statistical database to support your actions. So I think that right now there is information being gathered onto what are the biggest polluting sectors in Somerville, or where most of the pollution is being accumulated, or where most of the degradation is taking place, such that the city can take actions in those specific areas, and such that it knows what to remedy and how. Okay. So I suppose that some of the areas in which it is looking into is transportation, and for that it's pushing for use of bicycles. That would be one way of reducing diesel emissions.
Yeah, we have most of a bike path. We have a bike path that runs through a lot of Somerville and connects to the bike path all the way out to Bedford.
Just the one in Davis Square.
It actually comes from, you have to get through the part in Davis Square, but it actually starts on Willow Street. No, it starts a couple of streets before Willow, but it actually goes through an old railroad tracks into Davis Square. It's very hard to follow in Davis Square. And then it goes out through Arlington, Cambridge, Concord. It just goes all the way out, and you can take it out. It's actually a beautiful bike ride. But it ends in the middle of Somerville. It doesn't actually continue through Somerville. It's supposed to go into East Cambridge and onto the river, and would connect the bike paths of the river to this, and it would make an enormous impact if we could get the bike path to go all the way to the river. I use the bike path just to play, but it does never get me anywhere, so I can't use it as a commuting tool. And I worked downtown for about 3 years, and I did bike downtown, but it wasn't on the bike path. It was on all those crazy roads with those crazy drivers.
It's a challenge for somebody who wants to be more environmentally mindful. It's a challenge for them to actually put those kind of principles into action. You usually need some kind of city support. You need some kind of structure in place to make it easier for you to become the kind of person that you want to become when it comes to being more sustainable. So for that, there would probably need to be some of the transportation budget would have to be allocated perhaps to more sustainable transportation. So for example, some cities in Southern California have pushed for a 10% solution. They've reached a 5% solution, but that's still pretty good, in which they have pushed for an allocation of 10% of the city's transportation budget to be dedicated specifically towards improving or creating bike paths for the city. So it was a big success, and the city, the proponents of this 10% solution won 5% of the allocated transportation budget, right? And now for every single street in the city, there's a bike lane constructed adjacent to the street, so that it's very easy for people who would want to bike, people who would want to reduce their emissions, to put that into place. And in every single main road which leads into any of the adjacent cities, there's also a bike path alongside those main roads in order to get you to the other cities. So that is one specific way in which I suppose you could make for, you could push for more amenable facilities for bike users.
What are some of the other things that the Climate Action Group are working with? Do you have a list?
Some of it,
here?
yeah. Let's brush up. Some of it is energy efficiency, so it would push for better kind of appliances in your household. For example, Energy Star, or for example, fluorescent light bulbs as opposed to incandescent light bulbs.
Okay.
Or for example, in schools you would have these vending contraptions called vendimizers attached to your vending machines, which would save half of your energy. And this really makes sense
Oh, just the
in a
vending,
monetary way.
How much electricity a vending machine actually consumes.
I'm not quite familiar, but it would
No,
save
but
about
it-
half of it. And
But
they pay
that's
for themselves.
interesting, yeah.
Most of these appliances pay for themselves, and in addition, if there are enough incentives provided for insulation, I suppose, such as double glazed windows or better plumbing insulation, then there would be less water, there would be less heat wasted, and I think the city could save some big bucks in that area as well. Not just speaking environmentally wise, but just speaking in the manner of what makes sense
Right.
for anyone.
For the budget, we
Right.
all need to stay aware of our budget.
So for that, you could have energy retrofits for your heating, ventilation, and cooling systems. They're called HVACs, in which you just tweak your systems so that they run more efficiently. You just try to see that there's no fissures, try to see that there's no energy that's being wasted. You look at all buildings and you see if they're efficient, and you see if there is any kind of use in having them, or if you just probably make more sense to rebuild it all over again and make it more sustainable. Green procurement is one of the criteria. So if one is to buy, if for example the city is to buy a fleet of vehicles for the police department, they should probably be hybrids, or they should probably run on something that would not degrade the air.
Oh, okay.
Energy manager, having somebody for the city who would be in charge of coordinating efforts along the different municipal departments as to see how much energy is being used, how much you can save, and where are the areas where it's more feasible and most economically smart to save this kind of energy and money.
Yeah.
Promoting use of bicycles, we just talked about this. Evaluating green power purchasing in areas where it's not quite feasible to have renewable energy projects. So for example, if it's not quite feasible for us to have wind turbines because we might not have
Consistent wind.
auspicious wind
yeah.
for it, or we might not quite have the exact kind of grid interconnection for it, because you need to have power come away from the wind turbines and power go into it as well. You need to be connected to the grid. So
Okay.
in case you don't have those kind of conditions, you can still have renewable energy being used in your home, offices, and businesses. The city could buy renewable energy certificates, which are also called green tags. And these are credits which are bought from other renewable energy projects. And what they do is they help promote and they support renewable energy projects in other parts of the state or of the nation. So for example, as the wind turbines in Hull are producing energy, even though we might not be able to produce renewable energy ourselves, in order to offset some of our emissions or some of our harmful energy consumption or the like, we could be buying green credits from them or renewable energy credits from them. And that's just an extra addition to what we pay per month in energy costs. So that's just a way in which we can be better citizens and promote these green energies.
Okay, so it's a direct support of a system as opposed to the
Installing one yourself.
yeah, or getting and because the grid is the grid, and you don't know what energy really is arriving
Exactly.
at your house. Yeah.
Actually, I think Somerville is supplied by N-Star, and it's a very small percentage of it which is renewable. If citizens from Somerville can choose through Mass Energy to buy a different kind of energy, such as the kind from Constellation, I think it's a different power provider, they can buy a more cleaner kind of energy. So for example, one that's produced, one out of which a third is produced by green energy sources as opposed to having most of it produced by coal.
So how
or
would you
nuclear.
do that? I mean, I've never learned how you go about designating another power source.
Right.
How would you do that? And you said it's through the Mass Energy?
Mass Energy, I think if we look on their website, perhaps massenergy.org, I'm not quite familiar,
Okay.
or just search for it. They have different packages which are garnered or targeted for different areas. I think if you're in the Cape Cod, or if you're maybe in the northern part of the state, you can take advantage of some specific packages. In Somerville, we might have a different kind of packages which might be available, but they push, for example, during the winter for packages which include natural gas, which have reduced emissions as opposed to diesel or other dirty fuels. Massenergy.org, I believe. I'm not quite sure. One could search for it.
Yeah. Okay. So we can look up mass energy, Google it, and you can come up with some version that'll find it. And then in Constellation, is the power of a different energy source. That'll be all on that mass energy
I think so.
website.
I'm not quite familiar with power suppliers. I'm more familiar with, for example, key actions of becoming more sustainable through other means. I'm not quite familiar when it comes to buying electricity.
But that's, the more ways everybody chooses a way that's doable for them,
Right.
the more effect there is. So if we all take our own little area that we can deal with, because dealing with all of it is pretty overwhelming.
It can be. But if you have a wider array of action lists from which to pick and to tailor to your own kind of lifestyle, then there's a great likelihood that you'll have the chance to make an impact and to get involved into becoming more sustainable.
Yeah, okay.
The rest is all energy efficiency measures and green building practices. Green building, in addition to having a building be more insulated and be as efficient as possible, you would also try to see that it's made out of materials which are sustainable. So for example, for bathroom panels, you might have those construed out of recyclable plastic, and if you demolish the building which was in place of your newer building, you would recycle the construction and demolition waste out of that. Actually, that will be a law coming into the summer. It will be illegal to waste construction demolition waste. In addition to that, you can make buildings be more green by having renewable energy installations on them. Some of those are solar roofs, are solar panels, or solar thermal heating, in which you use the energy of the sun not to produce direct energy as with photovoltaic panels, but you would have those heat the water for your pools or for your domestic use inside the building. And lastly, moving away from what the residential sector can do, I think there is a big push in this climate action plan onto the businesses, since some of the businesses have the greatest potential of reducing energy consumption or becoming leaders in energy reduction and in buying green energy, and they can truly pioneer these kind of solutions for the city itself. So that is one area in which the city is focusing as well, which is great. I know that the state cannot work as much with businesses as much as it can with other sectors, but if the city can do that better at a local level, then all the more power to them. We can work on greater levels to affect the same kind of solutions.
So each level has to work, the state, the federal, and the local have different areas that they're capable of making changes in.
Well, in some areas they can mesh their powers and work together in a synergy. Some is just not possible. And instead of having a defeatist kind of mindset, it's great to see the areas in which you can actually and are allowed to make a difference or to push for some kind of institutional change.
Yeah, no, I think this has been great to hear about sort of what's really happening on the local level. We don't hear enough about that. What was the name of the Somerville group? Somerville
Climate Action.
Okay.
And that one can be found online as well. It's part of MCAN, which is the Massachusetts Climate Action Network. This network tries to pull together the different local areas and the different local groups and the different grassroots groups into making for a broader, more stronger, more cohesive coalition in trying to tackle climate change and trying to tackle environmental injustice and the inequalities. MCAN.
Okay, do you have a website for MCAN?
Not quite familiar, but I think if you do Massachusetts Climate Action network that leads to it. Mark Breslow is the leader of it, and they're very involved in any kind of legislation which is coming up, and in regards to toxic use reduction, regional greenhouse gases inventory, and any other kind of measures which deal with the ambient air and other kinds of environmental issues.
Right. Well, good. Well, thank you very much, Emmanuel.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's been really informative to hear about some local stuff. I think we think in terms of the ozone layer, and we think in terms of these big global things that we feel like,
It might be too overwhelming, and they feel that they might not particularly impact us. I mean, we hear about these kind of
we
these
sort
kind
of
issues.
know they
Right.
impact us, but how can we impact back? So it's
Exactly.
been very helpful for you to tell us that tonight.
Thank you.
So I want to say thank you to everyone that's been watching, and you get to do your own little group, your little have an effect here locally. Whether it's riding a bicycle or changing your light bulbs or doing it in the dark. I thought that's an interesting campaign. The colleges are doing stuff, and the communities are doing stuff, and there's work on the state level. So I just want to thank you all, and go find your local websites, and thank you for watching Dead Air Live. I'm Jean Flanagan. Good night. Yeah, so that was great. That was good.